based on true events. In the heart of New York's Hudson Valley stands an old mansion called Fox Hollow, where wealth and silence once ruled. But when Evgeny Anisimov, a powerful investor, and his wife Charlotte finally welcomed their long-awaited child, joy turns to conflict within hours. A diagnosis shatters the illusion of perfection, and a father makes a choice that will change everything. As Evgeny fights to keep his newborn son abandoned by the world that once praised him, a quiet war begins inside the mansion's walls. Love against reputation, truth against legacy. Stay with us until the end to see how one word, "I stay," becomes a promise strong enough to rebuild a family and transform a house once built for appearances into a home built for love. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and hope when the doctor entered, clutching a clipboard that carried more gravity than paper should ever hold. Charlotte sat upright in her hospital bed, her blonde hair tied back neatly as if control could be maintained through order. Evgeny stood beside her, his hand resting on the transparent plastic of the bassinet where their newborn son slept. The doctor's words came slowly, carefully. "We've noticed some indicators of trisomy 21. It's only a suspicion at this stage, but we'll need to run further tests." The sound of it didn't explode. It sank. Charlotte's back straightened, her expression freezing mid-smile. "You mean Down syndrome?" she asked. When the doctor nodded, her voice turned thin, metallic. There must be a mistake. But Evgeny, looking down at the baby's tiny fingers curled around his own, already knew there wasn't. The certainty hit him not as tragedy, but as an unexpected truth, something fragile and irreversibly his. Silence followed the doctor's exit, a silence sharp enough to slice through the air. Charlotte broke it first. "Evgeny, we have to think logically," she said, her tone clipped, rehearsed. "We can't handle this. He'll need special care, constant attention. We could find a family that—" She stopped when she saw his expression, the disbelief forming into quiet defiance. "A family," he repeated, voice low. "We are the family." Charlotte's eyes flashed with something close to anger. "You don't understand what this means. My parents, our name, our lives, Evgeny. You think you're saving him, but you're condemning us all to pity." He stared at her, unable to recognize the woman who once cried at the sight of a sonogram. "You're already thinking about how it looks," he said softly. "I'm thinking about what it is." The baby stirred, a tiny sound that broke his father's voice into something fragile and firm all at once. "I stay," he whispered. The argument burned quietly, with no raised voices, only the tension of words too controlled. Charlotte tried again, gentler this time, as though she could negotiate morality. "Evgeny, listen to me. It's not cruelty, it's realism. He'll suffer, and you will too. We could start again, later. The right way." Evgeny looked at her, really looked, and saw someone terrified of imperfection. "The right way?" he repeated. "There is no right way to love your child. There's only doing it." He turned toward the bassinet, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the baby, holding him against his chest. The tiny head rested beneath his chin, the warmth of the newborn seeping through the thin hospital gown. For the first time, Evgeny felt something loosen in him, the part of his heart that had been bound by ambition and order. Charlotte stood there, frozen between pride and loss, as he said the words that would divide their lives. "I'm staying. You don't have to." The divorce began before the papers were even signed. Charlotte's voice became a script of controlled departures, legal arrangements, PR mitigation, instructions for silence. Evgeny stopped arguing. There was no language left between them that could carry both love and fear. He signed what needed signing, not as surrender, but as clearance for a new kind of beginning. When he left the hospital with Ben in his arms, the sky was a pale blue, the kind that promised neither sun nor rain. He drove north in silence, the baby bundled in blankets beside him, every red light a small eternity where he checked if the infant was still breathing. There were no grand resolutions on that road, only the steady heartbeat of responsibility, pulsing louder than grief. When Fox Hollow came into view, its sprawling oaks and stone facade, the house that had always belonged more to Charlotte's lineage than to him, Evgeny almost turned back. But then he remembered June. She had served the family for 30 years, long before he entered the picture, long before money replaced kindness in that house. She opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes went from him to the bundle in his arms, and she understood without a word. "So it's true," she murmured, not as judgment but as recognition. He nodded. "He's my son." June adjusted her apron and simply said, "If you're staying, I'm staying." That night, Fox Hollow changed its language. June moved quietly through the halls, preparing a bottle while Evgeny learned to cradle the baby properly. The old house, once used to measured conversation and polite dinners, now hummed with softer rituals, feeding schedules, whispered lullabies, the steady rhythm of breathing. Evgeny wrote down everything June told him in a small notebook, terrified of forgetting something vital. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, but inside, something entirely new took root. Not perfection, not control, but a fragile living beginning. Fox Hollow, for the first time, was not a monument. It was a home in the making. Ben's first cries echoed differently in Fox Hollow, not because of their volume or pitch, but because no child had ever been allowed to cry there, at least not out loud. For a house so steeped in ritual and reputation, his arrival was both disruption and beginning. The staff, what remained of it, watched from a distance. Some left quietly, others stayed with uncertain loyalty, unsure how to reconcile the heir who didn't match the portraits on the walls. But June stayed, firmly, practically. She rearranged the west wing without permission, claiming an unused bedroom near the kitchen and turning it into a nursery. Evgeny followed her lead, though it felt like he was moving in a world made of fog. He had no rhythm for this life yet. He was a man used to spreadsheets and translated market reports, not milk schedules and diaper ointment. Yet he tried, he asked, he listened. And at night, when Ben's tiny body convulsed with reflux and frustration, Evgeny walked the hallways whispering lullabies in Russian, stumbling through verses his own father had once sung, not even sure if he remembered them correctly. The first days blurred, each one a lesson in humility. June kept a notebook on the counter, a running log of feedings, bowel movements, physical therapy stretches, notes from the visiting speech therapist who came with gentle eyes and careful hands. Evgeny, who once corrected investors on decimal points, now asked if a bottle at 3 a.m. should be 2 ounces or 3. "Watch his swallow," June instructed, placing her palm behind Ben's neck. "Not just the suck. If he's working too hard, we switch to a slower nipple." There were moments Evgeny wanted to scream, at himself, at the unpredictability, at how much he didn't know, but he didn't. He only wrote it all down, every detail, determined to fail a little less each day. Ben rarely responded, his muscles too loose, his attention scattered, but Evgeny refused to believe that meant absence. He clung to every breath, every micro-expression, every twitch that felt like progress. Charlotte had once described him as emotionally neutral, someone who didn't escalate or descend. But now, in this new chapter, he was all extremes. Exhausted, terrified, devoted, stubbornly hopeful. It was June who introduced the sensory toys. She unpacked them like tools from a surgeon's tray, rubber rings, wooden rattles, textured cloths. "He needs to feel the world with his mouth," she said. "That's how he'll start mapping it." She showed Evgeny how to roll Ben onto a therapy ball and rock him gently forward, backward, side to side. "Helps with vestibular input," she added, as if it were a word everyone just casually knew. Evgeny didn't, but he memorized the motion. He learned the pressure of his palm behind Ben's head, how long to hold before the baby melted into soft fatigue. Most sessions ended in crying. Not just Ben's, sometimes Evgeny's, though he did it quietly, usually in the hallway after the baby finally fell asleep. The responsibility weighed differently now. Not like business stakes or public reputation, but like being handed the last match in a storm and knowing you were the only one who could light the way. There was no delegation here, no assistant, no press release. Just him, a baby, and a woman who'd once scrubbed his tuxedo buttons before gala nights, now teaching him how to recognize the signs of silent aspiration. The nights were the hardest, the hours when the world went still and there was no performance left to maintain. When Ben cried out in bursts that seemed disconnected from any immediate need, and Evgeny couldn't fix it with logic. There were nights he questioned everything. Not the choice to stay, he never wavered on that, but whether he was enough. June would sometimes find him standing by the crib long after Ben had settled, his shoulders tense, eyes lost in some internal battlefield. "You're not supposed to know how to do all this, not yet," she said once, putting a warm mug of tea in his hand without asking. "The trick is showing up again tomorrow." And he did, again and again. He showed up for early intervention appointments, learned to read the subtle cues in Ben's face, tracked the slow improvement of neck control in the therapy journal. He celebrated half smiles like they were Nobel Prizes. He didn't tell anyone about the moment he practiced saying "Dad" in front of a mirror, trying to believe it belonged to him. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after the third visit from the occupational therapist. Ben had just finished a bottle. He was starting to take in full feedings without losing focus, and Evgeny was holding him upright on his chest for the usual 20-minute reflux buffer. June was downstairs, preparing a new schedule to include feeding therapy. Evgeny felt the weight of Ben's small body resting against his heartbeat, one arm draped over his shoulder like a question mark. Then something shifted. Ben moved his head slightly, chin resting in the crook of his father's neck, and pulled back just enough to look. Their eyes met. Evgeny stilled. For 3 whole seconds, the child didn't look away, not past him, not through him, at him. A gaze unbroken, as if he was filing away his father's face. As if he knew. And in that brief span of seconds, the house, the past, the fear, everything paused. It was a lock clicking into place, without force, without ceremony. Evgeny whispered something in Russian he wasn't even sure Ben heard. "I see you, my son." That moment redefined the house. June returned and found Evgeny still frozen in place, holding Ben like something sacred. "What happened?" she asked softly. Evgeny didn't look away. "He saw me," he said. June didn't ask what that meant. She nodded and returned to her planning. From that day on, the way Evgeny moved changed. Slightly more sure, slightly less afraid. The therapy schedules remained. The struggles didn't disappear. But a new word had entered the household vocabulary. Presence. Not just being in the room, but being attuned, responsive, anchored. Fox Hollow, long a home of rehearsed elegance and contained emotions, was now living by a different script. The sound of Ben's crying still came often, but it no longer echoed as intrusion. It belonged. It was heard. And in those 3 seconds of mutual recognition, a new reality began to grow, quiet but unshakable. A father had arrived, a son had answered, and the house had listened. It began the first Sunday of February. The snow hadn't yet melted off the outer stone of Fox Hollow's gate when June returned from the market, holding a single white flower, tucked carefully in a brown paper sleeve, no note attached. It was leaning against the left pillar, she told Evgeny, who stood in the hallway, rocking Ben slowly in his arms. He stared at the flower, white ranunculus, identical to the ones Charlotte had chosen for the baby shower that never happened. He didn't say anything, just watched as June set it on the counter like she would any other delivery. They both knew what it was, even if no one dared name it yet. The next Sunday, another appeared. Same flower, same position, same silence. On the third Sunday, it came with an envelope, thin, discreet, bearing no return address. Inside were clippings from a parenting magazine, headlines like "Why Some Families Choose Different Paths" and early adoption stories with happy endings. There was also a glossy business card tucked neatly between the pages. Adoption services of the Hudson Valley. "They're not even trying to be subtle," Evgeny muttered, knuckles white around the edges of the crib. June, calm as ever, took the card and slipped it into a drawer. By the fifth Sunday, it had become ritual. The flower arrived like clockwork, always the same pristine stem, always untouched by wind or rain. And with each one came more envelopes, each more invasive than the last. One included a printed photo of a smiling family in coordinated outfits, holding a child with Down syndrome in a perfectly staged backyard. Written across the bottom in looping handwriting, "He deserves more than pity. He deserves a life." Evgeny nearly tore it in half on sight. "They think pity is what I feel," he snapped, slamming the envelope onto the table. "They think love is only valid if it fits their narrative." June, wiping down the counter, didn't flinch. "Don't waste your energy," she said. "We don't fight the wind. We organize." And so she did. A box appeared in the study, sturdy, labeled by hand, divided by date. She catalogued every flower with a sticky note. Every envelope went into a plastic sleeve. Every message, no matter how cruelly veiled, was documented. "This is your insurance," she said, "in case someone ever decides to turn whispers into war." Evgeny tried to focus on Ben, but it was getting harder. The idea that someone, Charlotte, a relative, someone paid, was orchestrating a campaign to convince him out of fatherhood clawed at him in the quiet moments. Sometimes the threats were loud, dressed as concern. Other times they arrived in soft paper and curated fonts, but each one chipped away at something inside him. "They're trying to rewrite this story," he told June one night, watching Ben try to reach a toy lion during tummy time. "They want to make it about tragedy and rescue, as if I'm too proud to admit defeat." June looked at him, then at Ben, then back. "But this isn't defeat," she said. "This is a beginning, and they don't know how to read beginnings that don't look like their endings." There was a long pause. "Do you think it's her?" Evgeny asked quietly. "Charlotte?" June didn't answer right away. She wouldn't dirty her hands, but she'd nod in the right rooms. That night, after Ben finally fell asleep, Evgeny opened the drawer where June kept the plastic sleeves and began flipping through them like chapters in someone else's book. "Let them write what they want," he said under his breath. "I know my ending." As the weeks passed, the walls of Fox Hollow grew heavier with memories, some real, some imagined. Evgeny had stopped walking down the east corridor entirely. Too many portraits, too many curated smiles, too many whispers of what the house used to demand. He'd learned to listen differently now, not to the opinions of the outside world, but to the subtle cues in Ben's sounds, to June's firm but quiet nudges, to the shifts in his own instinct. Ben began making new noises, little coos that bordered on syllables, a tiny that sometimes came after feeding. "He's testing his mouth," June explained. "That's where words start." It was in those moments that Evgeny felt himself harden and soften at once, gritting his jaw against the world outside while melting for the one within. Every small sign from Ben was a stake in the ground, a new reason to stay rooted. The house that had once echoed only with propriety and preservation now began collecting different sounds. The rattle of toys hitting hardwood, the uneven tempo of little hands discovering texture, the soft breath of a baby trying to shape a world in vowels. By the third month, Evgeny had memorized the Sunday rhythm. He no longer looked surprised when June entered with the flower. He no longer asked if there was an envelope. He knew there would be. What changed, however, was his response. He no longer raged. He logged. When his lawyer called to check in, Evgeny told him plainly, "Keep a record. We might need to prove something someday." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. June, meanwhile, had expanded the box into two. She created a spreadsheet, old school, printed, taped to the inside of the lid. "If they ever say you weren't consistent, here's the proof," she said. Evgeny placed a copy of Ben's updated therapy log beside it. "Here's what consistency looks like," he replied. In the world outside, whispers grew louder. Social columns made veiled remarks. Speculation hinted at instability. But inside the gates, a different kind of order was forming. It wasn't the kind with silver trays and perfect posture. It was a life that had to be defended in inches and syllables, in bottles prepared at the right angle, in tiny fists grasping for connection. And yet, even with the outside pressure, something remarkable happened. The sounds inside the house began to drown out the ones beyond the gate. June played a soft jazz station in the kitchen that Ben seemed to like. Evgeny started reading to him, not parenting books, but Anna Karenina in Russian, his voice patient and low. Ben didn't understand, of course, but he listened. And sometimes, when Evgeny reached the end of a chapter, the baby would make that soft again, like punctuation. "He's talking back," June joked once, "probably judging your accent." Evgeny chuckled, but he felt it too, that sense that despite everything trying to separate them, they were building something that couldn't be undone by paper, whispers, or petals. Every Sunday, the flower still came. Every Sunday, Evgeny handed it to June wordlessly, and she documented it. The box grew fuller, heavier, but so did Ben's voice, so did their bond. And inside Fox Hollow, once a museum for appearances, the laughter of a child learning how to be heard began to matter more than the ghosts still hanging on the walls. June hadn't intended to go into the East Wing. It was a part of Fox Hollow long abandoned, left to the dust and closed doors that Charlotte had always said were better untouched. Still, something pulled at her that morning. Ben had fallen asleep early after his physical therapy session, and Evgeny was in the study reviewing legal documents related to guardianship and district services. June, with 30 years of housekeeping in her hands and instincts older still, walked down the corridor she hadn't dared in decades. It smelled the same, like furniture polish and old linen, but she wasn't there to dwell on memory. She was searching for something else, maybe not consciously, but searching all the same. Behind a door, stuck with disuse, she found an old nursery. Long stripped, half forgotten, a room that once held a cradle, now held silence. And on top of a low dresser beneath a yellowed stack of linens lay the notebook. Brown leather, worn at the corners. She didn't hesitate. She picked it up, turned the pages, and there it was. Handwritten instructions, day-by-day routines, tips on soothing, feeding, swaddling. Not printed, not impersonal. Someone had written this out with care, page after page, not for display, for survival. Later that afternoon, she brought the notebook into the kitchen and laid it on the table in front of Evgeny. He glanced up from his laptop, confused at first, then focused. "Where did this come from?" he asked, not touching it yet. "The old nursery," June replied. "East Wing, hidden under a pile of linens." Evgeny slowly reached out, opened the cover. Inside, in looping, elegant handwriting, were entries dated back nearly 4 decades. Soothing technique for colic. Gentle counterclockwise belly rub, 3 times daily. Don't panic if baby prefers right side when sleeping. Just monitor neck control. Rocking with pressure over chest helps regulate breath. Evgeny read silently for several minutes, then looked up. "Whose is this?" June shook her head. "No name, no baby photos, no initials, just erased. Her voice didn't carry anger, it carried recognition. This house knew how to care, at least one person did, but they were told not to show it. Evgeny flipped another page. That sounds familiar. There was no need to name names. No need to say Charlotte or her parents or what was expected of a Whitmore heir. The implication hung heavier than any accusation. It was history repeating. Only this time, someone had found the evidence. They both knew what the discovery meant. Fox Hollow had long prided itself on pristine appearances, on galleries of ancestors and curated moments. There was no room in its story for the children who didn't fit the portrait frames. June sat down across from Evgeny, her voice quieter now. "This notebook explains a lot," she said. "There's always been a pattern here. Things get hidden, neatly, elegantly, forgotten, without ever being named." Evgeny nodded, still reading. "And whoever wrote this," he said, running a finger along the edge of a carefully written entry about sensory stimulation, "they loved that baby. This isn't clinical. It's intimate." Under there were sections that had dried tear stains, a pressed daisy on one page, a folded corner with a single word, Thursday. No context, no further note, just Thursday. They weren't allowed to keep them, June added, or chose not to fight. Either way, the baby disappeared, but the care didn't. "It's here. It's written down." Evgeny closed the notebook slowly. "But Ben won't be someone's footnote," he said. "Not this time." The decision had already been made the day he said, "I stay." But this sealed it in another way, made it generational, corrective. A deliberate break in a long, silent lineage of dismissal. That night, after Ben was bathed and fed, June offered to take over the bedtime routine. Evgeny agreed and sat in the living room, flipping through the notebook again. This time, he wasn't reading it for information. He was reading it for voice, for presence. Someone had existed in these pages. A parent or a caretaker who hadn't fought the system but had tried to work within it. And now, all that effort lived quietly in ink, discovered too late for the child it had been meant for. "They wrote to remember," he said aloud, mostly to himself. "And we're remembering to not forget." June returned, drying her hands on a dish towel. "We should add our own pages," she said. "Start a new section, Ben's section." She pulled out a pen and in her familiar block letters wrote the date, the feeding time, and Ben's current weight. She pushed the notebook toward him. "Your turn." Evgeny hesitated, then picked up the pen and wrote, "Ben looked at me for 7 seconds today, unbroken, certain." He paused, then added, "This is how I know we're seen." They didn't discuss it further. Some things didn't need to be debated. They just needed to be written. In the following days, the notebook became a quiet companion. June logged practical routines, and Evgeny filled the margins with thoughts. What Ben responded to, what seemed to calm him, little phrases that surfaced when he least expected. He likes jazz. Doesn't fall asleep to it, but listens. Turns his head when I read in Russian but not in English. Interesting. Smiled today, could be gas. Hope it's not. These were not grand entries, but they mattered. They were real, tangible. A counter-narrative to everything being sent to their door in white envelopes and wilt-proof petals. The notebook, once evidence of someone silenced, was now a declaration of someone heard. And within that, Evgeny began to feel something shift in himself. Not just a father surviving day by day, but one actively building a history that would not be hidden. He was no longer reacting to what had been denied to him. He was choosing what would be preserved, and that, more than anything, felt like victory. On the 6th day, Evgeny found June in the study, carefully placing the notebook on a shelf beside the therapy binders. She wasn't hiding it. She was giving it a home. "We don't let this one vanish," she said without turning around. "This one stays open." Evgeny stepped forward, hand resting lightly on the shelf. "Thank you," he said simply. June glanced at him, nodded once. They didn't talk about the other baby, not directly, but the absence of name, of memory, of story. It all meant something. And the notebook now served as both ledger and gravestone, proof that once someone had tried. "Ben will not be forgotten," Evgeny said, almost to himself. June didn't reply. She didn't have to. In the quiet, in the placement of that book, they had already agreed. And as she turned back toward the kitchen and he returned to his son, neither said what they both knew, that Fox Hollow had buried its ghosts behind portraits and folded linens. But Ben would not be among them. He would live in pages left open, in memories made present, in names spoken aloud, and in a notebook that by some miracle of persistence had escaped the frame. They summoned him with the formality of a will reading, not a phone call from Charlotte, not even an assistant with a polite excuse, just a hand-delivered note embossed with the Whitmore crest, inviting him to a clarifying discussion over matters of shared concern. No location was listed, just the house, which everyone knew meant the Whitmore estate on Holleridge Drive. Evgeny didn't reply. He showed up, alone, no lawyer, no child, no hesitation. He knew what this was, a performance. A final attempt to carve out the discomfort of Ben's existence from the glossy family narrative like a bad paragraph in a press release. When he entered, he saw they'd rehearsed everything. The untouched silver tray of water glasses, the papers stacked in neutral folders, the quiet tension masked as civility. Charlotte was already seated, poised in a navy sheath dress that made her look more like a campaign donor than a mother. Beside her, her parents, Malcolm and Evelyn Whitmore, the executors of taste and legacy. They gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Not right away. He waited for them to speak first. Let the stage play begin. Evelyn started as expected. Her voice, delicate and controlled, carried the weight of generations accustomed to being obeyed. "Evgeny, we hope you understand the spirit in which we've asked to meet. This isn't a confrontation, it's a conversation." Malcolm folded his hands as if preparing for a board meeting. "We're concerned for everyone involved, especially the child." The word child hung like a warning, impersonal and clinical. Charlotte didn't look up. Instead, she added, "We've reviewed options. Several agencies have outlined viable paths for adoption, quiet, compassionate, and legally sound." Evelyn nodded. "You've done admirably, Evgeny, truly. But there are thresholds, limits to how much one man alone can offer a child with such complex needs." Evgeny said nothing. He let the words land: suffering, burden, better options. They dressed their cruelty in concern, their prejudice in polished vocabulary. And through all of it, no one asked how Ben was doing. No one asked who he was becoming. They only wanted to reshape the story into something palatable, one where no one had to be publicly brave or visibly challenged. Charlotte finally broke the silence with something resembling emotion. "You don't understand what this means for me, Evgeny. I was raised to carry something forward, a standard. This," she gestured vaguely, her hand slicing the air, "this derails that. He will suffer. So will you. And so will I, in ways you don't see." For a moment, Evgeny felt something close to pity, not for her, but for the narrowness of the world she had inherited and never thought to question. He reached for the leather folder June had packed. It was weighty in the hand, like something alive. He opened it carefully, without fanfare. One by one, he laid the contents on the glass table. The stack of envelopes containing anonymous articles and adoption pamphlets, photographs of white flowers at the gate, therapy schedules, medical reports, and finally, the codicil, the one tucked inside the old estate documents that linked monetary inheritance to heirs of proper aptitude. He placed the last item with precision, the old baby notebook June had found, with pages of a silenced story written in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. "What is this supposed to prove?" Malcolm asked, already bristling. Evgeny met his gaze without blinking. That this family has a history of erasing what it doesn't want to face. He turned to Charlotte. You think you're protecting a name. I'm protecting a person. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearls. You're being emotional, she said. You're not thinking about what's best in the long term. Evgeny smiled without warmth. Ben is the long term. Charlotte looked down, but didn't respond. For a moment there was nothing but the sharp stillness of entitlement, meeting a force it didn't know how to contain. And then, slowly, Evgeny gathered each document, each photograph, and returned them to the folder. He snapped it shut. Keep the salons, the silver, the portraits, he said, standing. I'll keep my son. And with that, he left. No apology, no second explanation. The door closed behind him with finality, not as rebellion, but as clarity. He was no longer the immigrant businessman who had married upward. He was a father who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. The drive back to Fox Hollow was quiet. Not heavy, not anxious, just still, like a breath held at the edge of a choice, only to realize it had already been made. As he pulled into the gravel path, he saw the kitchen light on. June was standing by the counter, holding Ben against her chest, the boy already half asleep. She didn't ask how it went. Didn't need to. Evgeny placed the folder on the entry table and loosened his tie. He walked to the kitchen and gently took the baby from June's arms. Ben stirred briefly, blinked up at him, then settled with a small sigh. It's done, Evgeny said, more to himself than to her. June nodded. Next feeding's at 2, she said, her voice low and steady. Evgeny smiled, not out of politeness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had claimed something essential. I'll be ready. He moved toward the stove to warm the formula, adjusting Ben in the crook of his arm like second nature. And as the water began to heat, as the weight of his son pressed gently into his chest, Evgeny felt something in him settle. Not ease, but purpose. He was home. And so the pact was sealed, not in courtrooms or estates, but in routines and resistance. The war over names and inheritance might continue outside those gates, in whispers and strategy. But inside Fox Hollow, something deeper had been won. No one needed to say it aloud. The victory wasn't in taking possession, it was in refusing to surrender. Evgeny fed Ben quietly at 2 a.m., June recording the time in the margin of the notebook. No grand speeches, no medals, just presence. A man and his child, a legacy redefined, not by bloodlines, but by choice. And in the silence of that small kitchen, the words that had once sparked a battle, I stay, resonated louder than ever before. The first time Ben laughed, it was so brief that Evgeny almost missed it. A strange little noise, halfway between a cough and a hiccup, that fluttered out as Evgeny made a silly clicking sound with his tongue while bouncing a rubber giraffe in front of Ben's face. At first, he blinked, unsure. Then he looked at June, who had frozen in place halfway through wiping down the counter. "Did you hear that?" he asked, eyes wide. She didn't answer immediately, just nodded slowly, the beginnings of a smile forming. "He laughed," she said quietly. "He really laughed." And then, just as if Ben had decided to confirm it, the sound came again, quick and surprised, almost like it had startled even him. It wasn't melodic or smooth, but it was unmistakably joy. It sliced through weeks of grunts, failed attempts, gurgled frustrations. Evgeny scooped him up, holding him close, and June came over to press her hand gently to the baby's back. "That's his sound," she murmured. "That one's his." And just like that, the silence that had ruled Fox Hollow for decades began to crack, not with grand speeches or declarations, but with a laugh that didn't run from the room, a laugh that stayed. Everything shifted after that, not in a dramatic movie scene kind of way, but in the quiet pivot of a household learning to move around a new center. Evgeny, who had once overcompensated with anxious over-preparation, began to act from instinct. He stopped second-guessing every movement. He no longer read parenting blogs until 3 in the morning. Instead, he spent those hours learning Ben's unique expressions, cataloging which facial cues preceded discomfort, which ones signaled overstimulation. June had printed a chart of baby sign language and taped it to the fridge. Together, they practiced with Ben, not expecting magic, but building a foundation. "This is where speech begins," June told him, showing how to mimic milk and more. Evgeny repeated the signs, slow and steady. And then, one morning, Ben raised a small, shaky hand and brushed his fingers together. "He signed more," Evgeny whispered, stunned. June beamed. "Then give him more." It became the rhythm of the house, small moments, big meanings. They didn't measure success in milestones anymore. They measured it in connection. The medical appointments, once a source of dread, became a string of quiet victories. The physical therapist noted Ben's improved neck control and prescribed new core exercises using a therapy wedge. The occupational therapist taught Evgeny how to turn daily routines into muscle-building opportunities, dressing time, bath time, even diaper changes. Instead of treating therapy as a task, Evgeny began to see it as play. "If he's not laughing, it's not working," one therapist had said, and Evgeny took that to heart. He bought puppets, made up songs, narrated entire mornings like a children's show host. June would shake her head, but never without a smile. "You're ridiculous," she teased once. And yet, somehow effective. Slowly, guilt loosened its grip. The guilt of not knowing enough, of not being enough. It was replaced by skill, by consistency, by presence. Ben began responding faster, engaging more, holding eye contact for longer stretches. His laughter, rare, precious, still surprised them every time. And each time it came, it was louder, more confident, a sound that declared, "I'm here, I'm learning you too." Fox Hollow, once known for its dinner parties and exclusive guest lists, began to feel different, not smaller, but truer. The invitations stopped coming. Charlotte's social circle had made its choice, distance, but Evgeny barely noticed. His calendar was now filled with IEP meetings, consultations with disability advocates, applications for early education programs. He started learning acronyms like a second language, IDEA, FAPE, LRE. He scheduled assessments, met with specialists, and began building legal protections around Ben like a fortress. "It's not just parenting," he told June one evening after a long call with an educational rights lawyer. "It's advocacy. It's defense." She nodded without looking up from the notebook where she was tracking Ben's new vocal patterns. "Love with a spine," she said. "That's what this takes." And he understood it now. Love wasn't the soft thing he'd always imagined. It was structure. It was standing ground. It was knowing when to speak and when to listen, and when to not let someone else define what your child is allowed to be. There were harder days, of course, days when Ben refused to engage, when his hypertonia made feeding impossible, when therapists gently warned that regression was part of the path. Evgeny didn't collapse on those days anymore. He paused, recalibrated, asked questions. June remained the still point in the swirl, her knowledge wrapped in humor, her patience a steady drumbeat beneath the chaos. "Tomorrow's another try," she'd say. "Nothing's lost yet." And she was right. Because for every frustrating hour, there was a moment like Ben reaching for Evgeny's nose with a determined grip, or the first time he turned his head when someone said his name. They added each of these into the notebook, their own growing history of resilience. "Progress," Evgeny wrote once, "isn't measured by leaps. It's measured by inches that change the world." And for Ben, every inch, every new syllable, every new motion was monumental. When Ben laughed again, this time full and giddy from the gut, Evgeny dropped what he was holding and June nearly tripped, rushing in from the hallway. They didn't need to ask what happened. They just stood there, grinning like fools, as Ben's shoulders shook from the joy of something only he understood. It was the kind of laugh that reached the soul, that climbed walls and seeped into the floorboards. The kind that didn't ask permission to exist. And in that moment, all the things that had once held the house in polite captivity, the legacy, the pride, the fear, broke a little more. Fox Hollow wasn't silent anymore. Not with Ben's voice growing stronger. Not with Evgeny learning to live out loud. Not with a family, broken and rebuilt, standing together around a sound that had once seemed impossible. And this time the laughter didn't vanish. It stayed. It belonged. It was the sound that didn't flee. The Sunday evening passed quietly, just like the others had before it, with Ben already asleep and Evgeny writing notes in the spiral-bound therapy tracker while June tidied the kitchen. It wasn't until she returned from the front steps, holding something small and white in her palm, that the silence became significant. "No ribbon this time," she said, lifting the flower slightly into the light. It was the same white ranunculus as always, but tonight it had been left bare, no tag, no wrapping, no bow, just the stem, clean and deliberate. Evgeny stood from the table slowly, stepping forward to look at it more closely, but not touching. "So it's not just ritual anymore," he murmured. "It's stripped." June nodded and placed the flower in an old jam jar from the back of the cupboard, half filled with water. She set it down on the counter and watched it float for a moment before adding, "It's a gesture without pose. Someone saying something, but not with words." Evgeny's eyes drifted toward the baby monitor, where Ben slept curled slightly to one side, peaceful. He swallowed. "Charlotte?" he asked quietly, not with accusation, just with curiosity. June didn't answer. She didn't need to. The question wasn't the point anymore. Evgeny found himself revisiting every detail, every flower, every note, every envelope filed and numbered in June's growing archive. The patterns had once felt invasive, coordinated, but this felt different. The absence of adornment was more intimate than any message they had received. "Maybe it's regret," he said, glancing at the white bloom. "Maybe she's trying to unlearn whatever made her walk away." June, stirring tea, replied without looking up. "People don't always know how to say what they mean, so they gesture, sometimes badly, sometimes better." He sighed and leaned against the counter. "You think it's her?" June turned to face him. "Does it matter?" Her voice was soft, not dismissive. "What changes for you if it is?" That stopped him. He looked over at the flower again and then toward the hallway, as if expecting a knock that would never come. "Nothing," he said after a moment, "but I guess part of me still wants answers. To all of it." June nodded. "We all do, but not all answers fix anything." She returned to her tea. "What matters is the ones who show up." Later that night, after Ben was changed, fed and tucked in, Evgeny stood in front of the notebook shelf with the baby journal in hand. He opened it to the middle, to the section where the handwriting shifted, less precise, more hurried, and ran his fingers over a half-finished sentence about breath regulation after crying. There was no name, no date, just a rushed note in fading ink. "Who were you?" He whispered, not to the notebook, but to the person who had written it. The mystery had gnawed at him since the day June found it. Someone in this house had loved a child once, and that child had vanished from history, erased from memory, unspoken in the family's curated narrative. "Was it one of theirs?" he asked aloud. "A sibling, a cousin?" June came into the room then, drying her hands. "There are stories in this house that never got told," she said simply. "Some were buried, others just ignored." Evgeny looked at her. "But we're trying to tell this one. We're keeping the pages open." June nodded. "That's why it matters." He closed the book gently, not with finality, but with intention. They weren't just preserving Ben's life, they were interrupting a legacy of silence. The next day, a letter arrived with no return address. Not like the others, this one wasn't typed or copied or disguised. It was handwritten on thick, cream-colored paper. No logos, no condescension, just a note, no more than 4 lines. There were others before. I wasn't strong enough to stop it. I hope you are. I hope he is. There was no signature. Evgeny held it in his hand for a long time. June read it once, then placed it in the box marked flowers. They didn't speculate out loud. There was no point. What mattered more was that the letter had not tried to convince them of anything. It had not suggested a solution. It simply confessed, and that confession, quiet and incomplete, mattered more than any of the polished denials they had previously received. It made clear what had always been buried in the walls of Fox Hollow. Someone had once tried and failed, but someone else had lived to regret that failure. Evgeny didn't pity them, he didn't forgive them either, but he accepted the thread and added it to the story they were telling now, not for closure, but for clarity. That night, he sat beside Ben's crib longer than usual. The baby stirred a few times, murmuring soft vowel sounds into his sleep, his arms stretching slightly before settling again. Evgeny reached in and brushed a finger against Ben's cheek. "We're not going to hide you," he said softly. "Not behind doors, not in files, not in silence." He stayed there, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his son's chest, and felt the strange ache of history pressing in and then breaking apart. Fox Hollow wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by absence. By the children never named, never claimed, never held long enough to fight for. Ben would not join them. He was here. He was real. And he was being raised in a house that no longer made room for shame. June passed by the doorway and paused. "We keep showing up," she said. "That's what makes the difference." Evgeny nodded. "That's what makes it count." And so, when the next flower arrived, again without ribbon, again with no note, June didn't comment. She placed it in the same jar, now stained with green at the rim, and returned to her routine. Evgeny glanced at it only once before returning to Ben's chart, updating notes about his vocalization patterns. He didn't ask who sent it. He didn't chase the origin, because something had changed. The questions that once gnawed at him: who left the flowers? Who wrote the journal? Who had failed to protect the last child? Had quieted. They still mattered, but not as much as the only question that shaped their present. Who stays? And in this house, at this table, in this story, he did. June did. Ben did. The rest, whoever they were, would remain on the outside, behind gates and unfinished sentences. The codicil came in a cream envelope, as elegant and sharp as the intentions behind it, delivered by courier, with a handwritten note from Charlotte's father, "For your records," as though what lay inside was just another estate formality. Evgeny didn't even open it at first. He knew what it was. He'd seen it once before, months ago, when June unearthed the copy from the archives, along with dusty legal binders no one had touched in years. He'd read the clause slowly then, each word tightening his chest. To be upheld in matters of inheritance, titles and properties applicable to heirs deemed apt for stewardship and representation of family values and legacy. After J. The word was dressed in politeness, but it sliced like a blade. Apt to stand in portraits, to carry names in society pages, to not make people uncomfortable at fundraisers or draw whispers at gala tables. Not apt to cry differently, move differently, need differently. Not apt like Ben. Evgeny read it again now, sitting at the edge of Ben's therapy mat while his son tapped rhythmically on a sensory board, delighting in the noise it made. Evgeny folded the paper once, then again, and walked straight to the front gate. He didn't slam it. That wasn't his way. He walked with quiet purpose down the gravel path, opened the heavy wrought iron gate that marked the line between Fox Hollow and the world beyond, and then closed it, firmly, slowly, from the inside, locked it, pocketed the key, and in doing so, drew a new boundary, not of property, but of principle. There would be no more negotiations, no more appeals to a legacy that had already made its decision. The Whitmores had made it clear who they believed was worthy of being counted. Evgeny was done proving that Ben belonged. Now the proof would be in the living, not the explaining. The gate, once ornamental, was now a line in the sand. This house, these rooms, this life, they were for the ones who stayed, who loved, who showed up. And that list was short but full. It included a baby boy who had just figured out how to mimic clapping. It included a woman who had raised 3 generations of Whitmores and had finally decided to choose who deserved to be raised. And it included a father who no longer asked permission to protect what was his. When he came back inside, June was in the hallway, holding the old baby notebook in both hands. She didn't ask where he had been. She just held the journal out to him and said, "It's time we put this one to rest." Together, they walked it into the study where the newer binders lived. Ben's therapy progress, medical notes, speech assessments, IEP drafts, and placed the old notebook beside them. June smoothed the cover once, like saying goodbye. "This was the last chapter of a story no one finished," she said. But it's not ours." Evgeny nodded. "We're writing the rest," he replied, "from page 1. The journal, once a painful relic of abandonment, was no longer a weight. It was context, nothing more. The past had happened, but it would no longer define what was happening now. The shame, the secrecy, it ended here, and June, without needing a signature or decree, stood now as co-guardian of that truth. Her authority wasn't in paper, but in presence. In every bottle warmed, every note logged, every time she stood between Ben and the world with unwavering clarity. That week, Evgeny made a series of calls, not to lawyers or bankers, but to the school district, to a disability advocate, to a community center that offered inclusive playgroups. "We're ready to begin transition planning," he said on the phone. "Yes, early, I know. But I want to build the scaffolding now." When asked about the family's resources, he gave answers without bravado, only precision. He wasn't using wealth as a shield anymore. He was using it as a tool. "Access isn't equality," he told one coordinator. "We're looking for belonging, not just services." The difference mattered. It was the line between being tolerated and being welcomed, between being viewed as a burden and seen as a person. And Evgeny wasn't interested in halfway answers anymore. He understood now that parenting Ben wasn't a detour. It wasn't a sacrifice or exception. It was a commitment to a life rooted in truth, and that meant building a world where his son wouldn't have to fight to be seen. June began writing in a new notebook, not for feeding schedules or physical therapy logs, but for Ben's milestones as they felt, not just as they occurred. Clapped with both hands today, looked proud. Evgeny cried a little, laughed when June said banana in a funny voice, repeated a sound that could be the beginning of BR. The notebook lived in the kitchen drawer now, next to the spoons and bibs. It wasn't archived. It was alive, and every evening they added to it. Sometimes Evgeny wrote long paragraphs, sometimes June just jotted a sentence, but it was theirs. Ben's. It didn't care about portraits or aptitude clauses. It cared about what mattered, who held him when he had a fever, who celebrated his first successful reach, who stayed in the room when the world became too loud. The notebook didn't ask who had rights. It recorded who had shown up. And so, with the codicil filed away and the gate locked from the inside, the transformation of Fox Hollow felt complete. The house no longer bowed to the family name. It no longer sought permission to evolve. It belonged to the present, to the child at its center, to the people who had refused to let love be dictated by pedigree or expectations. Evgeny stood at the window that evening, watching Ben roll clumsily on his playmat, determined to reach a toy just out of grasp. He didn't help. He waited, cheered quietly, and when Ben finally grabbed it, he beamed, triumphant, victorious. That was what mattered, not aptitude as defined by papers and clauses, but persistence, joy, presence. That was what made someone worthy. That was what made a home real. And with that, Evgeny stepped away from the window and walked down the hall toward the front door. He glanced back once, seeing June rocking Ben gently. The iron gate outside stood closed, strong, immovable. But this time, it wasn't shutting the world out. It was keeping something sacred in. A boundary not of fear, but of love. The mansion, once a monument to silence and selection, now protected something fragile and true. The line had been drawn, and from here on, the question was no longer who belonged to the family. It was who stayed to become one. Ben's first steps didn't come with ceremony. There was no therapist guiding his feet, no session planned, no camera crew or staged lighting. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, just after lunch, when June had stepped away to wash dishes and Evgeny was organizing the weekly therapy notes on the kitchen table. Ben had been standing with support for weeks, holding onto the edge of the low armchair in the living room, bouncing gently as if testing his legs like springs. That afternoon, though, he let go. Not all at once, just one hand, then the other, teetering forward with more instinct than control. His arms flailed for balance, his knees wobbled, but somehow, miraculously, he didn't fall. He walked 3 whole steps, awkward, wobbly, glorious, before tipping forward into the couch cushion, erupting into giggles as if the triumph had surprised even him. Evgeny stood frozen for a moment, phone half raised, his hands trembling as he hit record. He barely captured it. But it didn't matter. He'd seen it. Ben had walked, not in defiance of what was predicted or despite the diagnosis, simply because he could. And his laughter filled the room, cutting through every old shadow Fox Hollow had ever tried to preserve. June came rushing in seconds later, breath catching when she saw Ben still upright, leaning against the couch, grinning like he'd just cracked some sacred code. "He did it," Evgeny said, his voice caught somewhere between shock and reverence. June knelt slowly, tears already slipping down her cheeks. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached out, and Ben wobbled toward her. One step, then another, collapsing into her arms as she held him tight, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. This wasn't about milestones anymore. It was about presence, about watching something happen that no one else had believed would. The therapists had always been gentle, cautious in their optimism. It may take longer, they said, if at all. But they hadn't known Ben like this. They hadn't seen him reach for things just out of grasp every day for months. They hadn't watched him fall and try again, over and over, until his body learned to echo the persistence his heart already knew. June held him, rocking slightly, and Evgeny stood nearby, still filming with a hand that refused to steady. The house wasn't quiet. It was alive, with joy, with disbelief, with something permanent. Afterwards, Evgeny placed the phone down and walked over to Ben, who was now babbling nonsense into June's shoulder. He crouched beside them, brushed his hand through Ben's hair, and whispered, "You did it, Malish." His voice cracked, not from grief or exhaustion this time, but from awe. This boy, this child they said wouldn't thrive in the world they understood, had just rewritten the terms. June stood slowly, still holding Ben, and together they walked into the study. On the far shelf, beside the binders of therapy notes and developmental timelines, sat the old baby journal, its cover worn, its spine soft with time. June reached up and placed it gently next to a new book, Ben's school schedule, now filled with entry dates, program names, and first-day reminders. "That one's for the child who wasn't remembered," she said quietly, pointing to the old notebook. "And this one," she added, touching the new binder, "is for the one who never lets us forget." Evgeny nodded, eyes still locked on his son, who had now begun to babble toward the window like it was an audience. The past didn't vanish, but it made room. That's what healing looked like here, not erasure, but inclusion. The seasons had changed outside, though no one marked it with holidays or events anymore. The last flower, white of course, had arrived over a month ago. No note, no ribbon, just a stem, slightly bruised at the edge, placed gently by the gate. It hadn't been replaced since. June kept it in water until it browned at the tips, then let it go. She didn't ask if Evgeny wanted to preserve it. She knew he didn't. It had served its purpose, a gesture perhaps of apology or quiet mourning, or maybe both. But Ben didn't need symbols anymore. He had presence. He had witnesses. He had memory that would be made real through routine, not regret. Charlotte had vanished, not with violence but with absence, and that too had to be accepted. Not everyone is meant to return. Not every origin story needs revisiting. The love that stayed mattered more than the love that once walked away. The house no longer paused when a car passed slowly on the road, no longer tensed at every unopened envelope. The air, once held like breath, had finally been exhaled. Not everything was solved, but everything was different. Fox Hollow, for all its history of silence and spectacle, had become a home by accident and then by intention. The rooms were no longer arranged for display, but for life. Therapy mats over antique rugs, bibs in crystal bowls, board books piled on heirloom chairs. June didn't bother hiding the practical anymore, and Evgeny no longer apologized for the mess of living. They hosted no dinners, no guests of status, but therapists came regularly, speech specialists left notes on the fridge, and neighbors who once whispered now waved from the road. They didn't belong to the Whitmore name anymore. They belonged to Ben's world, and that world was growing inch by inch, syllable by syllable, step by determined step. June took to calling him our professor every time he figured something out on his own. Evgeny called him my revolution. Neither was wrong. Both saw him clearly, not as someone to rescue or compensate for, but someone becoming. And in the quiet of each evening, when the routine settled and the day gave way to sleep, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt held. That night, Evgeny sat in the nursery with Ben asleep on his chest. The boy's weight was heavier now, his legs longer, his breath deeper. Evgeny leaned back in the chair, one hand on Ben's back, and looked up, not toward the ceiling but inward. He remembered the hospital room, Charlotte's voice, the moment she said adoption, like it was mercy. He remembered his answer. Not loud, but solid. I stay. And now here he was, months and battles later, with that vow fulfilled not in grand gestures, but in bottles warmed at 3 a.m. and in therapy logs, in dozens of decisions no one would ever see. Ben shifted in his sleep, curling closer, and Evgeny closed his eyes. The house no longer asked who was worthy. It no longer demanded perfection. It had become what it never dared to be, a place where love happened in real time, in imperfect rhythms, in messy miracles. And as the night settled around them, Evgeny whispered into Ben's hair, with a voice both tired and whole, I stayed. He paused, then smiled. And now, so did you. We pour our hearts into every story we share here. Behind each video is a team that truly cares about bringing you meaningful, emotional journeys, just like this one. If this story moved you, subscribing to our channel helps us keep creating more content made with this same care, just for you. Please, leave a comment below. What touched you most in today's story? And if you haven't yet, take a moment to explore the other videos on our channel. Your presence here means the world to us, and your support makes all the difference. Thank you for being part of this community.